This is the story of my grandparents, Walter and Mabel, before they were married, and of my great-aunt Catherine McCall. It begins in San Francisco in 1906. Catherine and Donald had recently married and gone to San Francisco to set up an insurance company. They invited my grandfather, young Walter, to join them in their business venture. Catherine had a young friend, Mabel Wall Sanders, who she knew from school. That same spring, she invited Mabel to come for a visit. Mabel and her grandmother stayed at the Princeton Hotel just around the corner from their apartment. On Wednesday morning at 5:15, while you were at the breakfast table at home, Donald and I suddenly found ourselves sitting bolt upright in bed with the terrible noise of crashing glass in our ears and the house shaking violently. One of the first things we did was to hurry down to the Princeton to see how Mrs. Waugh and Mabel were faring. They were much unnerved, especially Mrs. Waugh. As we walked through the streets, we noticed that fires were starting in 20 directions, and then we heard the earthquake had broken the water mains, so that there was no water to be had. At 7 p.m., we decided to leave. Such a night as that burning city was, just a molten sea of flames in almost every direction. We reached the ferry finally, and as Donald said, felt like Lot of old as he looked back on burning Sodom. Everything here is a tangle. Mail and telegrams, and every other accompaniment of ordinary life is to be gotten at with some difficulty. You could imagine how it would be with 300,000 people changing their addresses, most of them to Golden Gate Park, of course, but at any rate with no mail services for several days. Now tent cities are pitched in several places, and the people are more comfortable. It is surprising to see how cheerfully the people in general are taking their losses. A few days later, Mabel and Mrs. Waugh returned to St. Joseph, Missouri. Walter returned to Montclair. Eventually, Catherine and Donald gave up on their business venture. When they returned to the East Coast, Donald became a Presbyterian minister. 4 years later, Walter and Mabel were married. Walter joined his father, uncle, and brother at the Bradstreet Credit Company in New York City, which later became Dun & Bradstreet. Walter and Mabel were in their early 40s when my father was born. They lived for many years in Boothbay Harbor, Maine. I will always be grateful to my grandfather for having the foresight to save these letters for his son, for me, and his great-grandchildren.